Prophets and message for us. Prophets are clear about their message that established covenant with God. In Genesis, to call to Abraham to have a unilateral covenant, whereas in Exodus we have the bilateral covenant. The prophets are foretellers of the future to amend the life or you will be punished. They are telling on the present and guided by the past, and they enlighten your future. You fail to fulfill the requirements of the covenant of the commandment of God. The future will be the outcome of the past and the present. In this case, there's no predestination, no freedom, and no role you have to play in your future. Unless you return to the Lord, your future cannot change. There is free will. The Torah has these prophets which are of the Elohistic, Yahwistic, and priestly and Deuteronomistic traditions. These four traditions mention God as Yahweh, Elohim. The laws are given in Deuteronomy, and the priestly worship is in the priestly tradition. There are two narratives of the creation stories. Genesis is Elohistic, Abraham is given. Exodus, Aaron is the prophet, but Miriam is a prophetess. In Numbers 11:26 to 30 and Numbers 12 6 1 to 15, we have other prophets mentioned. Deuteronomy 13:2 to 26, prophets led astray from the law. Prophets can be classified as former prophets and latter prophets. Former prophets include the aesthetic prophets, individual prophets, called prophets, cultic prophets, sons of prophets. Whereas the latter prophets include major prophets, which are 4, and minor prophets, which are 12. These are the classical books in the Bible, and the prophets are named after the books. Some are writing prophets, some are non writing prophets. Some prophets are part of the historical books of the Bible. The former prophets in the narratives are Joshua, Judges, the Deborah and other prophets. Samuel also prophets started. Not a will of God for the monarchy, and there were many other judges and sons of prophets at the time of Samuel. Nathan, Ahijah, Elijah, they were all prophets, and they accused the king of the wrong deeds done and asked for repentance and coming back to God. The writing prophets are not in a chronological order. They're not personally preached, but some of their disciples also can have brought all the writings together. They are pre-exilic, post-exilic, and exilic prophets. God and the people, relationship, and future doom. Post-exilic prophets speak about hope and not doom. The following are the stages of prophecy. First is aesthetic or ecstasy. Canaan was conquered by the Canaanite prophets, and they were followers of Baal and Asherah. In a religion that demands a relationship with God, there is no direct communication with God because He's in a different world. To communicate with Him, we need an intermediate prophet who has charismatic gifts, spiritual gifts, psychic gifts to know God's will for the people. He will go into a trance or ecstasy and use external means, profane means like hypnotic music, drugs, drinks, wounding, and then he will get into these ecstatic states and tell the message of God. This was a more Canaanite practice, but it came into the Israelite culture out of force. They started walking, jarring stiffly, wild gesticulations, singing loud, mysterious sounds, walking naked. These were signs of coming of spirits of God and perfecting the prophets. 1 Samuel 10:5 to 12, 1 Samuel 19:18 to 24 talks about groups of prophets. Second stage of prophecy were the individual prophets who were called for a specific mission, like Samuel, who preached against Eli and his sons. From idolatry to true worship, obedience is better than sacrifice. Called prophets or court prophets were law abiding to the king, stayed with the king, consulted and helped governance of the king. When monarchy started, prophets also started. The Pharaoh also had his supporters and ministers in the court who helped him with decisions. In the same way, the kings like King David had Nathan the prophet who opposed his policy of taking Bathsheba as his wife. You must obey God's will. That is what is pleasing to God. The words of God are more important. So 2 Samuel 12:1. The cultic prophets are related to the century, 4th BC century. After Solomon's kingdom was divided, Israel and Judah, they were kings of the north and kings of the south. They had full loyalty to the temple worship. There were prophets like Amos, Amaziah. The worship begins and you know the mind of God. Amos 7:10 to 14. The other prophets were company of prophets or bands or sons of prophet, like 2 Kings 2:15, 2 Kings 4:38, 2 Kings 9:1-3, and Isaiah 8:16. They had a master, others were disciples, and discipline was practiced. They preserve oral tradition of the master, published the master's prophecies. Asceticism, partial secluded life, like on Mount Carmel, they lived in caves. It was a prefigure of the monastic life. These sons and companies of prophets had a community life. With one master, they lived together, walked together. They had an ascetical life, that is personal asceticism, and as a community, they practiced fast and disciplines. They had a prayer life and preserved a prayer tradition, a prayer saga, that is a contemplative life where they ruminated, chewed, and the words of the Torah again and again till it sink in and assimilates in. They repeated these prayers again and again, and they had 7 times of day where they prayed the scriptures. These prophets were great contemplatives. Then we have the prophets of vocation. They are specifically called for a specific purpose by God. They were prophets in the Semitic cultures. They were called appealed. That is, in palaces and mentors, they were prophets. How did this? They wanted answers from the deities and their representative. The second type of prophets were Essenu, the cultic prophets of Estera, who sang hymns and chanting, praising their gods. Then there were Munhu. Munhus were aesthetic world. The deity's soul is possessed and inducing ecstasy and speaking for the deity. They started wounding, praying. They wore royal garments as outer symbol of official prophets. Especially, they were important prophets of those times. Then we have Nabu or diviner. The quantum is a speaker. Then we have untitled prophets who gave divine revelation, but they do not belong to any particular category of prophets. They give temple oracles, where the centers where the prophets gave prophecy as per the context. Oracle prophets were in times of crisis. They were major and minor oracles for the king, for inquiry, approach a deity, and to know the decisions. The nature of these oracles were assurance from the deity for her political welfare. Next king, war, king's concern, directly told the king the representation of the deity was the prophet. The status of the oracles were noted in all the records and told individually to the king. In the Assyrian culture, we had the Muhu, the Ragimu, the proclaimer, the Sabri, the revealer, the Seleta, or the center for the deity, and the unknown category. But in the Hebrew culture, we have the Nabi, which is a diviner or a outsider word. It's not a phenomena of the own. It's shared with other culture. A person who makes an announcement actively gives an announcement that he has received to reveal it to the people. He suffers for the people, or it could be passive. He's received to be called to give the message later. Then the second category is the Roha, or the seer who sees God's purpose. He is more than a Nabi. He has illumination of the future. No obligation to announce it. He has no such duties. But he is a son of prophet. Like Samuel was both a seer and a prophet. Then we have the Asa Elohim, which is man of God. Hosea is a visioner who sees visions like Isaiah. Nabi category would be the prophets like Jonah, Amos, Hosea. The Greek word for prophet derived from the word prophetis, or a speaker. It's to speak on behalf, in place of, or for a temporal period of time, to foretell about time. To speak, announce, communicate, and never be silent. To talk about the message of God and the action to be taken. He is a speaker, a singer, one who stands instead of God before the people to speak, to announce about the future, interpret traditions in the present with respect to the past, tell about the salvific acts of God and the deeds of God. Let us speak about the prophets. That was not only about preaching, but they had life witness. They were at the service of the mission. Their words were integral. The private life was also included in the mission. The life of endurance, they had no enjoyment. They had no fear of humiliation and threats. Their redemptive suffering, and suffering was part of the mission. You could not avoid the suffering. So, therefore, it was a greater call to be a prophet during all the times of Israel's history. Let us take some examples of prophet, like prophet Hosea. Hosea means the Lord saves. There was spiritual decline in the northern part of Israel. It was immorality, irrespirituality. The people-God relationship was at stake. So therefore, this prophet first in chapter 1 to 3 talks about his personal life, and for 4 to 40 talks about oracles. There are two dominant themes: the judgment of God and the love of God. We are two faces of God. Love of God is very intimate and personal for everyone. This is the most powerful image of this book. There are negative events which are meant to transform us for a deeper union with God. He is also called the prophet of doom. Prophet Joel. The word Joel means Yahweh is God. In the book of Joel, there is a harvest day of Pentecost, which is mentioned chapter 2 verses 18 to chapter 2 verses 27, 2:28 and 3:21. There's promise of indwelling and pouring out of the Holy Spirit on all people. The experience of a locust plague, chapter 1, 2 and 2:17, is a launch pad to start the prophecy. The main theme is the day of God, the judgment of the evil, the punishment and the reign of God, and the reward for the just. This is also the book which talks about the historical coming of the Messiah and the future judgment. Prophet Isaiah proclaims the holiness of God and the coming of the Messiah. The book has three parts: pre exilic, exilic, and the post exilic. The book is talking about the mission becoming part of one life witness. The life plus the message is inseparable. The call to vocation is also mentioned Hosea, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. There is a mention of Emmanuel, virginal birth of the Messiah. The immediate context is the prophecy fulfillment, but the historic context, and there is a possibility of future fulfillment. So then there is a book of Isaiah. Second part is the hope that in the exile God is part to play in their lives. Even their sufferings and trials, there is hope. Because God is not time bound and place bound. He is beyond all this. He has power. He is universal. He can save all. You need to reinterpret your image of God. We have to work with God through the pagan kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, where God uses these kings to fulfill his purpose. And then the book 3 is a post exilic time rebuilding of the temple. The hope for the people to be faithful to the word and the law, then they will have prosperity, and then the reign of God will become a reality in their lives. Then there is chapter 8 verse 3, the wife of the prophetess is also mentioned. There was a lot of oppression and insecurity at the time of Isaiah, so he also condemns these things. Prophet Jeremiah, exalt in the Lord, is used almost 146 times in the Bible. He is a pre-exilic to exilic prophet and then the man of sorrows. For almost 50 years he prophesied. He was establishment of the new covenant of God. He speaks about the love of God and the fear of God. Prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel made God's strength to be strong in God. He was a priest in exile with Jehoiachin. He witnessed Jeremiah's, the father of Judaism, also being persecuted. During the time of exile, there was a codified future for the people. So he uses the word Son of Man 93 times. Then you shall know that I am the Lord is also repeated many times. Chapter 34 talks about the leadership of a new shepherd and the duty to a sacramental life. There is a strong spiritual life, liturgical life, and no meaning if you only take it as a routine. But he talks about the temple a lot and the building of a new temple, because God will be the strength, the glory of God will return after exile. So there's deeper communion with God even in the darkness, the silence, and the solitude of the soul. You receive the divine communication through the Eucharist for us in our time. The God experience and spiritual life. The prophet needs to progress and in his revelation of God. He should be detached from getting attached to anything that is not of God. His silence, complaints, violence is a difficult journey in the dark, cold, heat, wild animals, etc. The theophany of God is efforts in the spiritual journey. He should be single minded in his purpose. Elevated thoughts, words, and actions. He should identify with his work and not a platform for a work which is meaningless. In cosmic science, there is no God, there is silent communion. Return to your mission, Elijah tells King of Judah. The mission is preaching and being the mouth of God, and secondly, related to God. One thing only in life, that is total dedication to God. That is a common mission. The spiritual life strengthens the ministry and experience God in life and the mission. For Jesus' life now in the New Testament is identified
as our life with God. This is the prophet trying to transform us into God. From life, we are tuned to the mission of life. Realization of the call has to live the being and the doing. Being is always you surrender your mind to God, whereas doing is even greater than that, is to do everything for God. Do not have abrupt starts and ends, but a life of union with God, being a quiet person of prayer and deep communion with God. What will we get in heaven? The Catholic Church states that you will get to know God as He is, love God as He is. This is the deeper spiritual goal. Once we are purified, we receive deeper communion with God and we know, we hear the word of God. It gives us a mission. If we are not successful, how long will things come back to normal? Every time you experience God, timely mission or unending mission, in the reality or in the union of God, you have to know that following God, how
If
I
we take the
am,
example of
being
Prophet
submissive
Elijah,
to
the
him, it
deeper
is futile
experience of
mission of
God, there
Isaiah.
was a
God
growth.
wants him,
There was no ambition. He is
wants
more
it
inner
that we
silence and he is not disturbed. He
accept
loves the silence and
the
the quietude and
futileness
not
of our
panics in
mission,
all the situations of
long-term
his life.
commitments, and
Elijah,
forsake
the Lord
all
is
that is
God, is a
not a
mission to have
success
one God as a
and live only
universal
for
God.
God.
He meditates and realizes the impending dangers of salvation when there is a famine, and suddenly the cloud appears and there is success. He kills the prophets of blood and fears for his own life. You cannot handle spiritual things in your own hands. There is utter helplessness of power and useless life. You cannot run. There is no help at any stage. There is only darkness. The inner journey, you are always alone. Even the servant is left behind. You can accompany people to a point, but God is active and God is opening and telling you. He never sleeps. You have to empty yourself and all your sins, and you need no reserve. Attain the quietude in the hands of God. There are three times the word is used: holy, holy, holy. It's a superlative zenith, the vocation of the classical prophet Isaiah. Had a God experience, even Jeremiah, the deeper awareness within, that they are convinced of God's glory and holiness. The movement to God is to understand the inner beauty of the holiness and the glory and the supremacy of God, and how is my relationship to God. How is the apostle relationship to God? When they caught the miraculous catch of fish, they realized who they were, that they were sinners, and who God is, God's holiness. The particular mission entrusted to you, each one of you, is already a prophetic mission. We need to grow in our relationship with God. There is no stagnancy in Christian life, there is always either progress or regression. Holiness is not a creature specific, but it is more spiritual realm. Therefore, God is a person. Begin a spiritual life and end a spiritual life with the centered on God and the deeper experiences of God, who is transcendent and eminent. So, thus, the real union is not the bodily union because we cannot see God and live. There is will be struck dumb. The mission is to experience God in the reality of our lives, not beyond our words. The main thing is holiness and my sinfulness and mere tiny human being, and let God purify me. Wash me clean for my mission and convert me so that I may speak of for God. Cry to God for passive purification. Love, justice of God are two sides of the same coin. When you're purified, you're given new status in God. Lessons from the different prophetic stages. Aesthetic prophets, they had an inner relationship with God. They not spoke for self, but they were the mouth of God. They practiced a life of virtue. They realized that the relationship and everything is in God's hands. They had an inner relationship but exterior good practices. They communicate only in ecstasy out of union and speak out the message. The main message for us is prayer is an art. We must have external pious practices and also practice virtue towards ourselves and others. The individual prophets preach to people and grow in the inner life. They are not for their own sake but for the sake of the community. They are sought after by the people. They are all charismatic prophets from the very beginning. They have a unique and a personal call of God and a specific mission. They are also having a refraining from all profane things. They are set apart to grow in the love of God. So, therefore, each of us at baptism is called to live a special vocation and a mission. Like Elijah, the Lord is our God, is our authentic God and the God of the universe. We need to grow in the consciousness of our mission as a Christian. Spirituality is a call to give out Samuel is called Nazarite for 3 years, dedicated to God. Samson led a lifestyle which was again a Nazarite lifestyle. The sign was his hair. The profane things have to be refrained, and we have to separate from the things of the world and act only for God. Court prophets like Nathan are loyal to God and the king. They proclaim a reign of God and have a heavenly perspective. They stay with the king, but their life of obedience to the Torah. They practice many virtues. They want to know God's mind in the wars and the succession and the judgment of the kingly matters. Everything is centered on king, that is God. The eschatological dimension is in the view of the next world, where we combine the prophetic dimension of the divine and the kingly realm. So, therefore, they do not fear against the king any message that is there to be spoken. The king is important, not the people. They are loyal to God and clear about the commandments and have a pure message for the king. These court prophets did not have a private life. They had to order their life with the sense of God. This is the attitude of Jesus. To know that we are ultimately useless servants, we have to always be ready for the master. The cultic prophets were in the century where their worship activity took place. God is at the center, their sacramental life. They mostly show an eschatological life, and again they are useless servants. Loyalty for a people to the king. The spirituality and activities of the liturgy are important. It is valuable till the death to have a sacramental life. For us as Christians, the Eucharist and the confession. There's not mystical union now, only in heaven. All others need is a Eucharistic union in this life. They are all centered on particular century, because after the Jerusalem temple was not significant, there were other small centuries like in Hebron or Bethel, where the cultic prophets were existing. They live under the same roof of God, all activities with God. Hearts are not far from God. The mystery of incarnation, the Eucharist, is for people of our times to be always living in the presence of God and doing everything for God. The sons of prophet live a life of true authentic discipleship, allow the discipline of the master and sacrifice and surrender everything, obedience to their master, community life, they are secluded from others, they have asceticism for their spiritual growth and a meaning in life. The next vocation prophets, all are called by God. Nobody owns their own life. God decides for us. We are the image of God. God is our shepherd, our spouse. And there's a covenant relationship between us and God. At baptism, God saves, not punishes. He gives us new life and a hope. This relationship with God has to be improved. So, therefore, we have to strive hard in order to live our vocations and to preach and teach others through life of virtue and pious. Like the prophets, let us be the mouth of God to the present generation which does not believe in God. There is relativism and the counter and the other cultural norms which blind the people to even the existence of God. Let us show them the new covenant of Christ through the Eucharist. There is new hope that restoration will come when the reign of God comes again at the second coming. May our Blessed Mother help us to live prophetic lives here on earth.